The federal government released its emission reduction plan yesterday, and the reductions for the oil and gas sector are 42% over 2019 levels by 2030. Alberta NDP leader Rachel Notley called them a fantasy. Alberta Environment Minister Jason Nixon said they were insane. Well, guess what? The Pembina Institute a couple of weeks ago released a report showing a pathway to bigger reductions than are called for in that plan. So I'm going to talk to Jan Gorski, who is the director of the Pembina Institute's oil and gas program and co-author of Decarbonizing Canada's Oil and Gas Supply. Cutting the sector's emissions by 2030 is key to reaching net zero by 2050. So welcome to the interview, Jan.
Thanks, Mark. I'm happy to be here.
Look, you've got 6 areas in which cuts can be made. So let's go through them one by one. Let's start with methane, which I think everybody agrees is the low-hanging fruit in this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we dive into methane, I just want to step back and zoom out a little bit in that, anytime we go down this path of making really drastic reductions, it always looks daunting. It always looks difficult. And this was the case back in 2015 when the Alberta government said that they were going to phase out coal. Everyone said it was impossible. Look where we are now. 2022, the goal back then was to phase out coal by 2030. The companies themselves, the utilities that own these coal plants, they've actually committed to phasing out coal by 2023, 7 years ahead. So this historical precedent is relevant, shows that these things are possible once you start down that path.
Well, I've called in a number of columns for the oil sector and the Alberta government to up their ambition. So I'm with you on that one. Okay, well, let's get into methane. So low-hanging fruit, how do we get the 33% or 33 megatons of reductions that are required, that are identified in your plan?
Yeah, so it's really more of the same, more of what we've been doing already. The government has, the Alberta and the federal government, they have methane regulations in place to meet the current target. I think it's still uncertain whether that target will be met, but to get to the next level, to achieve those 2030 reductions, we need to crank up the levers in those regulations. So really try and achieve deeper cuts in all the various sources of methane emissions. And all of that is possible. We know that all of that technology exists. It's economic. The IEA has even said that at current natural gas prices, much of these reductions are actually at zero cost.
Yeah, I remember a 2015 study from the Barnett Shale in northern Texas, and 50% of the leaks that they identified, methane leaks, were things like broken valves and plant doors that were left open. I mean, things that just could be fixed by routine maintenance. So I don't think it sounds like it's it's fairly doable and doable in a reasonable amount of time. Okay, let's talk about electrification, because this one, you're looking at 18 megatons a year. And Jan, the problem here is, where's the electricity going to come from, and what are you going to electrify?
Yeah, great question. So we looked at electrifying essentially engines. It's engines used in the production of natural gas and the production of oil, used to move oil and gas around in BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. The biggest chunk of those comes from BC, and most of BC's production is in the northeast corner in the Montney, where they will soon have a completed Site C dam. So they actually have a source of electricity in BC. They're the furthest ahead down this road. Not to say it's a trivial challenge. They do still need to build out some transmission lines to provide access to that electricity to all of these sites. So what we're saying is we're electrifying engines. And yes, you're right that new electricity will be needed to meet that demand across these provinces. So we will have to build new low carbon electricity.
And I think it should be pointed out that BC's gas, because they produce almost entirely gas in BC, has already been electrified to some extent, and their emissions are really quite low. The last one I saw was 0.3% is their leakage rate. So I guess they just have to do more of the same.
Yeah, more of the same. And BC is furthest along this path. As I said, they have a source of electricity. Their climate plan actually, it expects some reductions from electrification already. So they're already going down this path. And as you said, a lot of companies have already started electrifying. So it's really just doing that on a much larger scale.
Well,
And
what
then,
about okay? Well, what about Alberta? I mean, Alberta is the whale here in this conversation. It accounts for 26% of Canadian GHG emissions, far more than even Ontario and Quebec. So, what can be electrified in the Alberta oil patch?
yeah, it's the similar kind of things. It's again engines. BC is all gas, as you said. Alberta is a mix. We produce gas, we produce oil. So it's a mix of electrifying all those engines that are used on the gas side and on the oil side.
So in Alberta, where you've still got a fair amount of, I think it's like 42 or 43% of electricity generation is natural gas. There's, I think renewables are still under 10%. What does that do to your emissions calculations, and how are you going to build out the clean, like zero emission electricity to service the oil patch?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. So what we assumed is we looked at the Canada Energy Regulators, Canada Energy Futures projections, and we looked at their projections for the electricity grid in Alberta in 2030 based on a net zero scenario. So it's not quite as clean in BC, but it certainly gets a lot cleaner than it is right now. And I don't think any of that is out of reach. As I mentioned, we're already phasing out coal. We need to put more renewables online, but it's possible to get to that level. And 2030, we're not even at net zero yet. This is a low emissions grid, but not quite net zero yet.
Yeah, I think this is this kind of conversation has been needed for a long time because, as I'm fond of saying in these interviews, economic modelers say that Canada is going to need 2 to 3 times as much electricity by 2050 as it generates now, because we're going to electrify stuff. And one of the things we're going to electrify are sectors like oil and gas, at least partly. And we haven't figured out yet, or we're not even talking about where that electricity is going to come from, because we need a lot of it. So I think this is maybe a good way to, hopefully this will kickstart that conversation. So now let's talk about carbon capture, utilization, and storage. This is getting a lot of attention within the industry and government and in the media. You've targeted 15 megatons a year for CCUS. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so those 15 megatons come from several different sectors. So we're assuming that you have some carbon capture at refineries in Alberta, in the Edmonton area, that have access to the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line. We're assuming some carbon capture from gas plants. So some of these gas plants, some of this gas is sour, and it actually comes with, when you drill for gas, it comes with carbon dioxide. It's called formation CO2, and it typically just gets vented, and it's really quite cheap to capture that CO2 and put it in the ground from these gas plants. So we're assuming that most of this formation gas gets captured, and then the other big chunk, 8 megatons, comes from the oil sands. And we're taking the oil sands net zero pathway lines at their word here for their 22 megatons of reductions by 2030, and 8 of those megatons come from carbon capture and storage.
Well, let's talk about the oil sands, because you've got oil sands and other measures for 14 megatons. Now, when I look at the investor presentations for the oil sands companies, I see Suncor out ahead, head and shoulders above the others. They produce 19 megatons a year. By 2030, they pledged to cut 10. So I didn't see the other companies queuing up for the other 12. Can you tell us where that's going to come from?
Well, this is the challenge right now. As you point out, there's the discrepancy between the plan we see from the Oil Sands Net Zero Pathways Alliance and the decisions we're actually seeing from the companies. These companies have recorded, some of the highest revenues they've seen in a decade. And last year, it's forecast that the revenues will be just as high in the next year. So they have a lot of cash flow to spend. It's not very likely that we're going to see that invested in new large greenfield projects. And so really we're waiting to hear for these companies to start announcing how they're going to use this money and how much of this money they're going to put into reducing emissions. And as you say, that's the gap right now.
Assuming that they could, what would they do?
Well, CCUS is a big one, right? Carbon capture projects take some time to build and get approvals for. So that's certainly something that needs to be started immediately. And then the other options, these 14 megatons that you talk about, are smaller things: fuel switching, process efficiencies, solvents, those kinds of things.
Yeah, some of these technologies have been around for a long time. In fact, the use of solvent instead of steam, or to replace some of the steam anyway in a steam chamber for steam-assisted gravity drainage. I mean, Synovus has been talking about this for years and years and years and years, and has kind of dragged its feet because it really wasn't in the best economics. And I think this is something that needs to, a point that needs to be made, is the companies kind of think they can do this at their own speed, when it's convenient and when it's economic, and we'll get around to it. And really what this is about lighting a fire under these guys.
Absolutely. And, to the industry's credit, they've spent a lot of time and money doing research on solvents and various technologies. And Alberta has shown a lot of leadership on carbon capture and storage as well. We have 3 projects now. We have a trunk line to move that CO2. And now, as you say, these companies really need to put their money where their mouth is and actually start investing.
Well, we'll see how that goes. Now, facility end of life. I assume this is, like an oil sands project or two that it's come to the end of its life that'll be wound down.
Yeah, so the example we point to is Suncor. The Suncor base mine is slated to come to end of life by 2030, which is obviously a very critical milestone for us. So this is a facility that, if it were to come to end of life, we would get 3 megatons of reductions from.
Okay. And we'll finish up with other, which is 20 megatons. It's a fair amount. What is that, and where will the reductions come from?
Yeah, so the other, again, there might be other facilities, not the large scale oil sands facilities, but smaller oil operations that might be coming to end of life. That would be one option. Another option is methane. So one of the things we know about methane is that methane emissions are much higher than the numbers currently show. They're potentially, there's now a growing body of studies in Canada that shows that methane emissions could be double what our current inventory shows. And what that means is that if those emissions are higher, it means that the reduction potential is also higher. So we say in our report, and this is based on a study that was conducted in Alberta, that 33 megatons of reductions are possible in methane. If methane emissions are double that, it means that you can double that number and you can expect 66 megatons, and they're going to be even cheaper.
True, but then what you've also done is you've added another 33 megatons onto the 191 megatons that the sector already emits. So now you're up to 224. So I'm a little fuzzy about where the other is going to come from, but can you give us any more clarity other than the methane?
Well, there's, on the methane side, I mean, you're right, there's some math there. The baseline will go up, but you're getting deeper reductions. We're saying that 88% reduction is possible with methane. So you have more emissions, but you actually get more reductions from methane. So the math works out, somewhat coincidentally, that you could get, if methane emissions are twice as high, you actually get an additional 20 megatons.
Okay, so if I understand this correctly, the government the target used to be 40 to 45% for methane. Then the federal government upped it recently to 75%, and now you're saying it actually could be 88% by 2030.
Yeah. So the report that we have referenced says that an 88% reduction is possible.
Okay. Well, I guess my takeaway after this conversation, Jan, is that this doesn't look like a fantasy. This doesn't look insane. this kind of actually looks doable. I mean, you know, the industry is going to have to spend some money instead of giving it back to shareholders in the form of dividends and share buybacks. And the government's going to have to put in, both levels of government are going to have to put in some cash as well. But this doesn't seem, you know, it doesn't seem impossible.
It's possible. I think, you know, as I mentioned before, these challenges always look daunting at the outset. And once you start along that road, it starts to look a lot more possible. So really, we have all the pieces now. You know, the government is starting to craft policy to pave the way for these companies to start making these reductions. So we need strong government policy to lead the way, and we need companies to start making these investments to start reducing emissions.
Well, Jan, I always appreciate your insights. Thank you very much for this.
Yeah, thank you, Markham. Always a pleasure talking to you.